Good evening and welcome to tonight's public meeting. Because I forgot to hit record last night, I'm going to go over a few of the initial slides and introductory materials today, and then we'll get into tonight's meeting. To start, we're here tonight to talk about regulation updates proposed by the Policy Committee of the Air Pollution Control Board, specifically updates to Regulation 1.02, definitions, 1.11, control of open burning, 1.13, control of objectionable odors in the ambient air, and 1.15, version of federal regulations incorporated by reference. Before we get into the regulatory materials themselves, I wanted to go over the regulatory process a little bit that APCD uses. First, we identify regulations to be developed and revised. And you'll see next to some of these steps, there's a handy sunshine symbol with a PP in it that stands for public participation. These are opportunities for the public to participate in the regulatory process here at APCD. One of the ways we invite public participation is at that stage to identify things that might need to be changed to our regulations. After a regulation has been identified for updating, we form an internal work group and scope out what we think needs to be done. Then we undertake drafting of changes to the regulation internally and review those materials internally before we're releasing them to the public. Often, when we believe there will be significant public interest, the first stage of public participation in the changes themselves is the advance notice of proposed rulemaking or informal public review stage, where we often hold public meetings such as this one. This is an optional stage, which isn't always gone through, particularly when we believe materials will be more routine or less controversial. After this stage, we'll take the materials to the Strategy or Policy Board Committee and ask them to approve them for release for public comments. At this stage, we sometimes have another public meeting, such as the one we're having tonight, to invite questions and answers from the public. And during this stage is when we accept formal public review and public comment, including through public hearings. Finally, the materials are taken to the board for a final decision on whether to approve them. Just looking at what's still to come in this particular rulemaking, the materials have been released by the Policy Committee of the board back on November 11th. The public comment period is running currently, began on November 16th of last year and runs through February 16th. And we are hosting this public meeting tonight. In addition, we'll be hosting a public hearing on February 9th and continued on March 15th. February 9th portion will be an evening meeting starting at 6 p.m. here at the Edison room with the Edison Center. The March 15th hearing will be at 10 a.m. preceding the normal regular board meeting of a month. Just a few differences between a public hearing and a public meeting. Public hearing is a formal legal requirement. It's an opportunity for the public to make oral comment on the proposal, and the district accepts those comments and responds to them later in a formal response to comment document. The district provides an overview of the proposed action at these public hearings, but does not include an opportunity for questions and answers about the proposal. Public meeting, on the other hand, is more informal and not required by regulation or law. It does not include an opportunity to submit oral comments on the proposed action, but we do provide that overview of the proposed action, in this case, except an opportunity for question and answer with the public.
Right now, this is a proposed action. It is on our proposed actions page, highlighted in the red box here. You will also see a number of other proposed actions out there, including a couple of Title V permits. You will see all of the materials that are out in the lobby today here linked on that page. You can view them at your own leisure. Feel free to shoot us any feedback on those too. Including the RLSO, which is short for red line strikeout. That just shows highlighted what is proposed as compared to the current version of the rule. The PREA, which is the preliminary regulatory impact assessment, which really contains more assessment of what's proposed, more explanation of the rationale and logic, things such as costs and benefits would go in there. and then an FAQ sheet that we've developed in advance of this public meeting and was posted a little bit later than the rest of those documents. The PREA, the RLSO, and the regulation draft itself are all legal requirements. They are something that we have to put out there. The FAQ sheet is something we put together to hopefully make the overall explanation a little bit more accessible. Before I go into each individual regulation, I just wanted to highlight something here that pertains to a number of the proposed regulations. And that's a comparison that we have made in the past of the location of facilities within Louisville Metro to demographics within Louisville Metro. As you can see on the left, regulated and permitted facilities tend to be clustered around neighborhoods of persons of color due to a number of reasons, including historic racism, redlining, and patterns and practices of the past up through current times, and zoning. On the right, you'll see location of facilities as compared to median income, and see that they are also clustered in particular around lower median income neighborhoods. Moving forward into the regulations, Regulation 1.02, the proposal would incorporate a list of trivial activities into the regulation itself and update the definition of volatile organic compounds. In particular, the definition of VOCs would be updated to be consistent with the most recent definition from US EPA by incorporating an exclusion for a compound known as HFO 1336MZZ-Z, as it has been found not to be a contributor to the formation of ozone. It's a mouthful, it sounds scary, but this doesn't have anything to do with toxicity or the hazardous nature of the compound. If it were a HAP or a TAC, this change would not impact that. However, it isn't actually listed as a hazardous air pollutant or a TAC, so it's not really pertains to what's happening here. The list of trivial activities that's being incorporated directly into the rule is one that the district already uses. It's just something that we have previously posted on the website and made available in a more informal way. We are formally incorporating it directly into the rule. That's come particularly at the request of EPA. They want to see it actually formalized in the rule so that any updates that happen, any changes that happen have to go through that regulatory process rather than just happening in any haphazard way. I will say it hasn't happened in any haphazard way. We have had the same list, I think, for a number of years with no changes, but to meet those requirements, we really want to make sure it's formalized. Regulation 1.11 deals with control of open burning. This one, we are proposing to allow the use of accelerants in certain circumstances. Right now, you're not technically allowed to use lighter fluid or any sort of fluid or gasoline or diesel or anything like that to start a fire. However, we've heard from prescribed burn practitioners, those people who actually go out and do these prescribed burns in agricultural settings or forest land management, those sort of settings, that it is typical practice that they use a certain amount of accelerant in starting those larger prescribed burns. So in that situation, we are proposing to allow the use of gasoline or diesel or kerosene to start those fires. They do still have to apply for a permit to start those prescribed burns, so we would expect them to list that as part of their permit, I believe, permit application. Regulation 1.15, I'm going just slightly out of order because I know the interest tends to lie in the last one, and I'll get to that one last. But Regulation 1.15 deals with the version of federal regulations that we incorporate by reference. In certain other areas of the district regulations, in particular Regulation 2.05, which deals with prevention of significant deterioration, Regulation 5.02, where we incorporate a number of national emission standards for hazardous air pollutants, and Regulation 7.02, where we incorporate new source performance standards. We have to periodically update what version of those regulations we are adopting by reference. This would adopt the most recent version of all of those regulations. And finally, Regulation 1.13, this is being proposed to align the language with the Prohibition Districts Enabling Statute linked there. One of our several enabling statutes is linked there that deals with prohibition of air pollution, and to provide additional notice regarding our current enforcement practice and policy. On the right-hand side, you'll see, just like with those earlier maps, that odor complaints, the yellow dots, tend to be clustered in central and west Louisville in particular. And just highlighting the change and how it lines up with the statute, KRS 77.1552 in part states that a person shall not, nor shall any agent or employee of a person, nor shall a person as agent or employee of another. So nobody shall discharge from any source whatsoever such quantities of air contaminants or other material which cause injury, detriment, nuisance, or annoyance to any considerable number of persons or the public, or which endanger the comfort, proposed health, or safety of any such person. Some of that language was sort of abbreviated in our regulation previously. We are fully spelling out that we follow para 77.155, subsection 2 in particular, by adding that language, such quantities of air contaminants or other material, and any considerable number of persons. In addition, that insertion of the word substantial comes at the advice of our Jefferson County attorney, who stated that that lines up with public nuisance common law. So the requirement is generally in the rulings from courts that it must cause substantial injury or detriment. Also wanted to highlight that the proposal would not apply to any violations that have already happened before the amendment of the regulation. It aligns with current law and the district's current enforcement practice and policy, and will not affect how we enforce the rule in the future. However, we did want to point out, in interest of full transparency, that as part of a mediation agreement with Swift Port Company regarding violations of the regulation, the district stated that it was our intent to propose these revisions in the future, and Swift, who had no part in drafting those changes, did think that it satisfied some of their concerns about the regulation. The board is not bound in any way by the agreement, so the board can choose to adopt or not to adopt the suggestion that the district is making with these changes. And just really quickly, if you are online, you can take a quick snapshot of that QR code to get to that place where you can subscribe and stay informed. You can also follow us on Twitter and Facebook to get updates on these as they proceed. And with that, I'll open it up to questions. If you're online, feel free to unmute yourself and ask a question. If you feel more comfortable, feel free to raise your hand and I can unmute you. If you're in the room, feel free to just shoot it out.
For regulation 1.13, section 2.1, it talks about odors being objectionable when there's documented investigation. And so I'm curious to know what is involved in the investigation with regard to instrumentation. What specific instruments are you all, compliance officers or whoever might come out, what instrument are you using to measure, and in what unit of measure, like parts per billion, parts per million? Does the instrumentation, is it calibrated for chemicals that are commonly found being emitted from Rubbertown Chemical Facility?
I'll pass it off to others on that one.
So I'll just start off by saying that the district's odor investigation process, our standard operating procedure, is available on our website, and it really walks through how we investigate and document those odors. Steve?
So we don't use an instrument other than our node, and we use a scale that's on line. I'm not going to try to repeat it word for word, or I'll mess up. But it has to do with a physiological response. So whether you can detect the odor and other odors, whether it makes you physically want to leave the area, or is making you sick. So that's the kind of scale we are using.
Okay, so with regard to that scale, when you have people who've lived in impacted areas and they smell odors often, what's the science behind being acclimated to smells in such a way that you wouldn't know that an odor might be a little excessive and that you might need that it may prompt you to call?
I don't understand what you're asking as far as.
So what I'm asking is, you're saying that you all use your noses to detect whether or not there's a physiological response to an odor.
Right.
And what I'm asking is, on the other end, so for instance, when we're reporting odors, a lot of what is asked of us is, did it make you sick? Did it make you feel a certain way? well, is there a science behind, because impacted communities are acclimated to smell, maybe they don't get the same sort of physiological reaction that someone who lives somewhere who doesn't get odors might have. And so that makes it difficult for impacted communities, just another barrier to protecting ourselves because we can't really tell that the emission may be a bit excessive.
So with respect to this regulation, it's a common nuisance standard. So it's different than, for example, the STAR program, which looks at the concentrations for non-cancer and cancer-based impacts. Your nose is the most sophisticated, and no instrument can go as low as your nose can smell certain chemicals or certain odors. That science is just not as sophisticated as what we carry around with us. Other programs do use a device known as a nasal ranger. And Steve, feel free to jump in here. The state of Kentucky, for example, uses a dilution standard and a nasal ranger, where essentially the device takes in 7 quantities of clean air and if at the end of that nasal ranger device, the person who is smelling through that device perceives an odor, then that may violate that standard. So the box isn't detecting a concentration, it is actually diluting that standard with clean air to then ask a person, do they observe an odor at the end?
Important to note, this regulation says no one shall cause that objectionable odor. The state's regulation says no one shall create an odor that when diluted with 7 parts clean air to the 1 part ambient air, you still smell it. And that's where that device directly relates to that requirement that is not the same requirement here. So in their world, smelling it with your regular nose will get the investigation, but to call it a violation, they run a lot of air through a carbon filter to clean it and a little bit of the ambient air and see if you can still smell it at that dilution.
But to your point, many people can report odors, and that really helps us with our concentration. And to some extent, a widespread odor with lots of reports helps us understand how many people are seeing and smelling it, and may help rebut some of that potential nose blindness that does go on. One thing that we've been working with US EPA on is some technology that could be placed in the field in a known location where we have lots of odors, and then using multiple reports, kind of a crowdsourcing way, trigger that canister to take a sample that could later be analyzed in ways that may help us see lower levels of chemicals or chemicals that may be combined. So that's a project that is in process. It is in early stages. And we've done some preliminary testing with US EPA for their app that will be connected to this. They call it the ROC. I'm forgetting what the acronym is at the moment. Anyway, what will be connected to that system that would then grab that canister. So when they're ready to come back out, I think our understanding is they'll be here this spring. We'll work with the community to locate those pre-placed canisters in areas of maximum complaints and hope that we'll be able to get people to report odors to us. So crowdsource it.
So what is your effort on getting people to report? Because in section 2.1, it also says another thing that deems it objectionable is if any considerable number of persons. So part 1, what does considerable mean? But part 2, we've had problems with the air pollution control district responding to odor complaints. And so now the feeling in the community is that, why should I report? I mean, people complain about it all the time, but they don't call you guys because their feeling is that there's not going to be a response. A compliance officer's not going to come out. If it's after 5 o'clock, which the odors are stronger in the evening and early mornings when you all are closed, then people will not call. They're not going to waste their time because we have other things to do. So what sort of campaign are you guys going to initiate to encourage people
So that is a really great point, and I understand what you're saying, and I understand what we're asking. We don't work 24 hours. We are 8 to 5. However, we can have our compliance officers, and do, ask them to go out on after-hours investigations when we have information that shows us that there's an issue going on. The other thing that's important to remember, and the Smell My City app right now is an excellent way for us to communicate, because MSD also receives those reports. They do work 24 hours, so they do monitor those reports. And our experience this summer has shown that many of the concerns and complaints have been related to sewers. Not all of them. We look at that data, and Steve and his group and the community compliance team have done after-hour investigations, particularly this summer. And you're right. Observing odors, it's more pronounced at night and in the morning. There's some meteorological issues related to that. Those concentrations tend to loft during the day when the air is warmer. So during the daytime, there's a higher ceiling. At nighttime and in the morning, that ceiling presses odors closer to the ground. For many of the odors, particularly hydrogen sulfide, like we've experienced this summer, those are naturally closer to the ground. And so your observations are understood, but we do need people to continue to call us. And do you have suggestions?
You all are going to have to initiate that. Right. What I'm suggesting is that you all craft a campaign where you're advertising on the platform, on the news, at Metro Council meetings, to Metro Council members, telling them, please urge your constituents to call us, even if they think it's just a sewer order, because, you know, with the whole sewer thing that happened this year, everybody now thinks every odor is a sewer odor. And with regard to the meteorological, you know what I mean, to the way weather is, whatever. Right. With regard to that right there should be the exact reason why we have the strictest regulations that we can, because we can't control the weather necessarily. We can't control it, but we can control the amount of emissions coming out of these chemical facilities. So the lower we get it, the less the weather will impact it in ways that will be adverse to our community. So we can't, you know, I can't really I can't take the excuse that, oh, it's the sewer, or oh, it's because of the pressure and the you know, whatever the meteorologist says, because we still have chemical facilities emitting chemicals. We still have MSD, which on one day, and I think I sent you an email, I sent somebody, that they were flaring one day, and I could smell gas everywhere in several, different neighborhoods. And so with my limited understanding of flaring, I'm thinking maybe that flare is not sufficient. So this little flame's going up, but I'm still smelling gas permeating the ambient air. It must be a huge amount of stuff coming out. What does MSD need to do in order to burn off things before they come out? Absolutely. So with respect to the campaign, we will continue to reach out to our Metro Council peers. We regularly send them materials to distribute, but your suggestion that we attend Metro Council meetings, I recently was before the Metro Council in December on odors, particularly those from MSD, and we'll continue to reach out to them for opportunities to speak with them about that. Any other suggestions that you have about how to reach people on odors? We really appreciate that feedback.
Yeah, I just will say we've tried some of those strategies and have to continue doing that, and definitely look for ways to amplify those strategies, but then new ones to add to that as well.
Well, while we're talking about odor complaints, I don't know the question of what is a considerable number. And then Byron mentioned some of the additions come from legal terms. So is that a legal term? Is there a legal
that one does come from the statute.
It does, comes right from the statute. And even before that, you know, I want to be clear, without that addition, it does say, or to the public. We're really talking about odors that are publicly accessible,
right,
that violate, you know, or that are objectionable to the public.
right,
Where we have you know, a map that shows we have so many complaints. We have had a few odor issues in the past, particularly where one neighbor, for example, is objecting to another neighbor, where that's really kind of a neighbor fussing with another neighbor. It might not rise to the level of a considerable number of persons or the public. So that's an example. But again, that language is being added to match KRS 77.
Right.
So it's not intended to be a change, it's just intended to make our regulation consistent with our statute.
And I think I'll say the best way to explain what rises to a violation for us might be to defer to Steve's assessment of maybe describe how COs investigate odors, what they go about doing, and when they determine there's an odor violation. Because I've been out with the COs, and their process is pretty, I won't say scientific, but it's definitely, they've got a procedure down.
So they'll go out and observe where the report is. If they detect an odor and they suspect they know where the source is, they'll go downwind of that source, try to find the highest spot they can, document that, drive around to the other side. As far as a considerable number, we have had, at least in one instance in the past few years, one person has complained about a facility. That's not considerable. Anytime we're getting complaints about Rubber Town stuff, that is always considerable. We are regularly getting complaints. That's not a way of filtering that out.
Right. And I'll add, so the one person that was followed up on still, and there was not an odor detected by the CO. It was not apparent in any public space.
Right.
I have just 1 second. So what was the time frame between the report of that odor and the time the CO arrived on the scene? Because it's been my experience that when I've called in the past and when others have called in the past, no compliance officer will come for, it'll be like 30 minutes or 60 minutes. And this is why REACT has asked for you guys to locate compliance officers in the Park Duval Fire Station substation, because Park Duval is where plenty of odors are complained about, not just sewer odors, I'm talking about historically too. So if you all had a compliance officer at a satellite location, at the fire station, or at Neighborhood Place in Gema, then they would be able to be deployed probably within 10 to 15 minutes to wherever someone calls in an odor.
That's a good point, and I appreciate that. You know, odors can be fleeting, but the data that we receive in those complaints, we actually use that not just to respond to in a reactive way, but we then take that data and proactively put together surveillance routes where our community compliance officers will routinely go through at various times of the day, independent of any complaint, to check out an area. So, Steve, do you want to talk a little bit more about that? The surveillance routes.
So we have 4 COs, and they're assigned to different parts of town. So they'll spend part of their day, every day, out in their part of town that they drive around. There's another one serving as a dispatcher, taking complaints and calling out to the field, sending them to specific areas.
Before we get past the considerable number in the public, like the idea of the public is faulty, right? Because there isn't just one. There are public, just like there are neighborhoods and there are different communities. And I guess my worry is if we would say like a considerable number of persons in the public, a considerable number citywide looks very different than a considerable number in a specific neighborhood, and odor is very concentrated. So I'm wondering if there's something we could do with the language there to ensure that considerable number is in relation to how much odor can be very, specific and concentrated.
So it's a considerable number of persons or to the public. So it's not a defined group within the public. It's really just an amplification. To some extent, this is 1952 language. When we have a complaint and we have multiple people making those complaints, we take all of our complaints seriously. As Steve said, even the one that we received from one person about one facility, that information is meaningful to us. We investigate, and then we add it to a surveillance route if we have repetitive complaints. So, in terms of that, our statute is set, and county attorney has recommended that we make our regulation match the statute.
I think certainly understand why folks are concerned that it went from, two persons to considerable number, and I think that's very legit. But there's also the other side of a possible odor violator, alleging we were acting on one complaint and pointing out to a judge that the statute actually says this. So, just to give you both perspectives, because I think your point's very well made, but I don't believe it's the intent of the district to make it harder for a threshold of complaints to get our attention.
And I wanted to make one follow-up point. Just seems like a good opportunity to point out the public comment period is still open. So if you do have suggestions, definitely shoot those to us in comments also.
Any definition of the substantial in terms of legal, as a legal term, what that means?
Substantial comes to us from the public nuisance common law. So it has a little bit like, I guess, they say about pornography, that a judge will know it when he sees it. What the district has done, with respect to that is each of those complaints we see as adding to that body of substantial. So where we have considerable number of persons or the public, we have evidence that that injury is substantial. When we have that situation where it's one person, one facility, that can be more difficult to reach that substantial threshold. But particularly with Rubbertown, you can see from our maps, we have a substantial number of reporters, and that's information that we take into our practice and our investigations.
The last thing I have on 2-1, I didn't want to miss a distinction you made when you were responding to Ebony. You said this wasn't in relation to the START program or something, or you said something about this is different.
Yeah, this
Could
is...
you repeat? You might be a little soft-spoken, just making sure everybody on the phone could hear, because it seems like an important distinction. Rachel, you mind repeating the question?
I do not. Let me be sure I get it right, Dr. Poole. Dr. Poole has has asked us to distinguish between Regulation 1.13 and what the STAR program does with respect to controlling chemical emissions. So our Part 1 regulations are general nuisance regulations. So they are almost, if you look back through public nuisances, that's where these types of regulations come from. The STAR program is a different type of regulation in that it's very technically oriented for emissions of what we call toxic air contaminants, or TACs, from certain companies. And for those emissions, what we're looking for there is an evaluation of their potential to cause harm. So we're looking not at, we're looking for risk, cancer risk, non-cancer risk, based on those emissions. That's where we include those provisions in a permit, and we build the permit record keeping, reporting, and monitoring around those limits. So
You see the same thing with the NACs for particulate matter, or SO2. They have a numeric threshold, and then they're measured against that. This reg is pretty old, but I think it was much more generally being in a qualitative sense. Not that we're ignoring those health effects that can come from things you smell, but that in and of itself, this reg really was saying no one shall cause objectionable odors. And I think we all know, or I certainly know, that there are people who do cause objectionable odors, and it's not always easy to deal with, but that this really wasn't trying to, not that maybe there's some good ways to do that, technology is advanced, but it wasn't trying to set a measurement. It was when people are smelling something objectionable, we don't want to allow that, and we want to fix that. And I think that's where those differences in those numeric standards really are highlighted.
And just to point out, this is one of the district's foundational regulations. Although the district has been here since the 1950s in its current form, and earlier something called the Smoke Commission, when EPA was chartered under the Clean Air Act, one of the things that we had to do in order to accept delegation of that federal program is stand up a regulatory program of a certain type. And so you see this regulation as one of those foundational 1972 regulations. It's a little aged, and you'll see, many of those Part 1 regulations are general nuisance standards from that same time period. STAR is really a it shows the growth and development of air pollution control work, as well as changes in community expectations. And STAR, of course, passed in 2005. So it's controlling air pollution in a different way with a lot more knowledge about that air pollution.
So I know I've said this already, but I guess I'll say it a different way. So because part of what the compliance officer does is observe the odor, does this mean if the compliance officer does not observe it, that there's definitely not going to be a notice of violation issue?
It does require, our rule requires that there be a documentation by the district of the odor. So for us, that information from folks letting us know what they're smelling and when they're smelling it is really important for us to dispatch our compliance officers if those odors are occurring after hours.
So if they get to a spot and they don't observe an odor, do they just stop the investigation, or do they visit some of the chemical facilities?
So it depends on where that odor is. We do get odor complaints about different parts of the city. And Steve, do you want to go back through the SOP and how an odor investigation is conducted?
Spoke earlier, they'll observe not just the part where the complaint was made, but around the areas of the complaint. In certain parts of town, there are areas up and down Bell's Lane, for example, over on Algonquin and by Park Duval, where there are common odor complaints made. So if we get a complaint from that area, it's not a go out to one spot, sniff, and then get back in the car and drive away. We will drive around. If the complainant has given a description that matches a known air pollutant of a chemical company, they will call the chemical plant. The COs are empowered, and several of the plant operators call.
One other thing that we do is we rotate those community compliance officers through the various parts of the city, because we want to be sure that they have fresh noses and eyes and an understanding of the chemical kind of makeup of the community that they're in. So they do that on a quarterly basis, Steve?
We haven't.
So why did the Attorney General recommend that you change to match the statute?
It's not the Attorney General, it's our Jefferson County Attorney. And, in terms of our regulations, all of our regulations are subject to challenge. So places where regulations can be challenged because, for example, they don't match the statutory framework. And in terms of regulatory power, the statute is what gives us our authority. And so the regulation is an expression of that. And if the regulation, for example, were to be broader than what that statutory grant is, it could be challenged. So all this is doing is taking the language of our statute and making sure that our regulation is consistent with that. Sometimes with APCD regulations, and not Reg 113, but heaven knows some of our other ones, and Byron can attest to this. Over time, various people have drafted and redrafted and revised our regulations. And because you have various people doing various things to the regulations, sometimes they change over time in inadvertent ways. There are also certain regulations, not these, where I feel like at the end of the day and looking at their regulatory, changes over time, I've played a day-long game of, regulatory Sudoku, trying to figure out when that change was made and why they made that change if I can, and to better understand what may need to be revised to go forward in the future. But for these changes, again, our county attorney has recommended that we make these changes so that they're consistent with our authorizing statute.
So in the workshop process, did you guys workshop different potential language, or was this kind of the first one proposed and it seems that that's what was going on?
This is the language that the county attorney has recommended to us because it matches KRS Chapter 77. With respect to, odor regulations, of course, the state has a different odor regulation, which Matt really described.
There were and have been internal dialogues about different variations on it.
So the state gives you authority, and you can't be any more stringent than what the state is?
We can be more stringent where appropriate, but our regulations have to match that authorizing grant. So, you know, in this case, CARA 77-155.2 is specific. The STAR program is a good example because we don't have a statute that specifically speaks to it. We have one that says the board may, by weight or measure, propose regulations to regulate other things.
You know, if you think, and this isn't a directly exact comparison, but, you know, these statutes are what the state legislature passed. So kind of like the Clean Air Act at the federal level, that was passed by Congress. But then EPA, kind of like us, makes these more specific regulations. And so, you know, they've tried to get out there on climate change, and they even have, you know, passed regulations that do something, but then the courts say, but the Clean Air Act didn't say that, so you can't really enforce that regulation. This isn't to that level of, you know, groundbreaking environmental regulation, but that, you know, those state statutes could change, and they're not meant to be word for word what's in our regulations. But
I just put that full statute up. It's kind of illegible there, but there are two parts to it. One of them says, the one that we've been talking about, any person shall not, nor shall an agent or employee of that person discharge any air contaminants or other material which cause injury, detriment, nuisance, or annoyance. But there is a first part to that that says a person shall not, nor shall an agent, et cetera, discharge into the atmosphere from any single source of emission whatsoever, any air contaminant in quantities and for a period or periods in excess of applicable emission standards established by the board. So that one really is what governs the STAR program, I'd say.
you know, if you're trying to get someone to stop doing something, you don't want to give them an easy ability to say, what you're asking me to do is not really within your authority. I'm not saying that's what's really happening here. I think we have a lot of authority, but that there is a side of this that doesn't want to stop putting out odor and looks at those statutes as important legal documents that can be compared to our regulations and make that regulation look unenforceable
If
or
you,
inappropriate.
what you just read maybe protects STAR to some degree. That why STAR is not, we're not afraid that somebody's going to challenge STAR, number one, and number two, is STAR can be challenged more than it's already been, well, no, I'll take that back. Why can't we utilize STAR and include a little bit more in STAR so that, you know, this odor thing over here, but under STAR, maybe there's a different odor component to it.
So that's an interesting point, and it's one that I hope you'll add to a comment and submit that during the STAR program. But I will say, you know, that the STAR program does look at, for the covered chemicals, that non-cancer impact. And that may include things such as a concentration that's been known to cause a headache or nausea. What one person may find objectionable with respect to odors is a very interesting kind of, you know, we've received some complaints on things you would expect. MSD, chemical company odors, rendering. Those are odors that people generally would agree may be objectionable. But we also receive complaints about coffee roasting, which some people would find attractive. Believe it or not, bakeries and burger joints. So how odors may be objectionable to one person and not objectionable to another can be a very subjective thing.
I think, you know, STAR is a good example of where we're more stringent than the state rules, but it doesn't have to be done through STAR to be more, you know, if we wanted to pass a rule on dust, it wouldn't need to go through STAR to be more stringent than the rules. I think there are folks out there that do kind of challenge STAR, and it's unfortunate, but I think because of how serious those health, not that odor is not important, but those very real issues around cancer and other severe health detriments I think makes it harder to argue, but that was more than they had to do. But with odor, it's not carrying the same weight as some of that. So folks may be more willing to challenge that odor as opposed to say, well, we're going to challenge something that's a proven carcinogen and a technique to regulate that. So kind of 2 points there. But the first one is we don't have to go through the STAR reg to do things differently than the state statutes. That's just one example too. So,
And
you know, just so that you have, hopefully I'm right,
with that,
using them providing knowledge, you could make a comment and this rule could change to say all kinds of things. Might not work, and it might lose if we ever were to enforce it, but that you don't have to hold to what we're showing you as that statute. That's the reasoning we're adding the language, but there's not a law against other words going in this exact reg.
and, you know, odors are a vexing issue for many communities. You know, ours is unique to some extent. But that said, if there are examples of other regulatory programs that you believe are more effective, please refer to that in a comment and say it should be like this instead of that.
I do want to point out, you mentioned kind of the level of sense of urgency more for, you know, chemicals that are carcinogens or cause other sort of chronic illness versus an odor. But I hope that you all start considering the impact that odors trigger mental and emotional responses from people, which are also health issues, serious health issues, because of the anxiety that's caused by you smell something that's off. You don't know what to do with your family.
Quality of life
I called 911
issue.
the other night because we had our window open and there was an alarm going off.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't a tornado alarm. It wasn't any alarm we've ever heard. When I called this whole system of call 911 if it's an emergency, call 911 because you guys told us that before too. If you think it's an emergency, call 911. And let me tell you, that created such anxiety in me because when I called, they were like, you know, they asked the questions and they're like, well, we haven't gotten any calls. And I'm saying, listen, I'm listening right now to an alarm that is loud in my neighborhood that is unidentifiable. I need you to call emergency management agency or whoever the emergency, like I was given 911 instructions on who to call. And I'm the one trying to get my son to get our emergency preparedness backpack in the car, like trying to wake everybody up in the house so that we can leave our home in case something is happening. They treated me like I was just, you know, what's the big deal? Nobody's called us. I don't care if nobody's called you. I'm the first line of defense. Me, in my neighborhood, in my home. If I hear the alarm, how's the emergency management agency going to hear it? Not only that, if it's an alarm coming from a chemical facility, maybe they don't have time to report it within the amount of time that they're supposed to because they're trying to, you know, they've triggered their alarm, but they're trying to stop whatever emergency is happening. So I'm going to need you guys in this city to get some sort of proper word for these 911 operators to say when somebody says there's an alarm going off, I'm scared, I live near chemical facilities.
The point well taken.
It was totally unacceptable. Then I called the non-emergency police, and they're like, well, we haven't gotten any. I'm like, I don't care if you've gotten any. Who is going to go out and investigate? And who's going to tell me what the source of this alarm is? And so still to this day, I don't know what the source is. Me and my family drove all around and around, and then I just was like, just forget it, let's go home. But nobody in this city that has all these risk management plans, Title V facilities, nobody in this city government is keeping people in my neighborhood safe because they don't even train 911. What do you do? What's the freaking flow chart so that when someone calls, that they're not just left like, you know, what do we do? You know what I'm saying? I love my family. I value my family. And I don't want them to be in a situation where you know, we just don't know what to do.
So a couple of just observations. Quality of life issues are real impacts. And I respect what you're saying about those. With respect to the type of area and some of the hazards associated with those, we've had conversations about emergency management issues, and I will be sure to share your concern about 911 and kind of that hazard communication aspect with others as part of the Greenberg administration and how they are, you know, building their form of government. It is a concern. There is a hazard communications plan. I don't know if that's been finalized yet. But in addition to raising this with Nicole George, under whose cabinet we're going to fall, I'm going to reach out to Jim Bottom and be sure that we talk about where this would fall under that hazard communication plan.
I want to add one more thing, if you were complete. Just these sort of things are things we'd love to hear in comments as well. I will caution the comment response may not be satisfactory toward you. It might say that's beyond the scope of this particular rulemaking, but rest assured, having it in writing for us to share with those people,
Absolutely.
we might not be able to respond necessarily in this particular rulemaking to concerns such as that, but having them in writing so that we can carry them to those other agencies and say, look, people are expressing this to us, please help us address those concerns, is valuable to us.
Thank you. I'm going to ask if there are any online.
Yeah, I was just going to say, we have a number of online folks. Feel free to speak up or raise your hand. Feel free to just unmute yourself. If you have any comments, questions, anything of that nature. Oh, one more important thing to note. I think I pointed out during the presentation, this is a public meeting, so those comments, we are hearing them, but they will not formally be considered during the rulemaking process. So if you have comments that you expressed today that you would like us to consider during that rulemaking process, please submit them in writing or come to that public hearing on either February 9th or March 15th and express those so that we can formally consider those as part of this rulemaking.
No one online has one. I have one more, but it's, so only the writing that's in red is up for debate.
Correct.
Is that
Only
correct?
that is what's being proposed for change right now.
Yeah.
If anything else were suggested for change, we would probably have to do a separate rulemaking for it, but that doesn't mean that we wouldn't take that into consideration.
Well, is there, I'll just ask, the general question, this is for students, the general question was about 2.3 under section 2, you know, regulation 1.13, and it's about having some sort of, you know, having to install, maintain something to control the odor. And their questions was kind of like, how does APCD assess who has that equipment or needs that equipment or if it's working? And I guess the question generally would be in other regulations, is there precedent for building in like checks and balances into the regulation, or is that separate?
I'll defer to Steve. I know that a number of facilities have been asked to put into place odor mitigation plans. And when that comes up and what all goes into those, I'll leave to Steve though.
I think, right.
Okay. So the vast majority of our control devices, and some of this is a little more than that, are driven either by a regulation that specifically says for this kind of process you must reduce by this amount, or it's through this triggers a BACT requirement, so a case-by-case review to see if there's a control that works. When it comes to odor, we certainly know certain sewage treatment, rendering, chemical production. So on those, typically and we don't get many first applications anymore. A lot of these companies have been around a while. If it were a brand new company coming in, we'd say, we need to see an odor plan. We need to talk about odor control. Hopefully, and not all, if they're in a stinky business, they're already preparing to do some of that, and then we can work with them to do even more. With an existing source, it's usually driven after there are complaints and an observed, not necessarily an NOV, but an observed odor issue on our end, and that's when Steve's team would work through either Sure, you can go ahead with the mechanism.
So when we go out and do inspections, either routine inspections or as a result of complaints, a lot of times we use the permit aside from just going out and smelling. A lot of these companies, for example, Swift or the companies that roast coffee, have control devices that they wouldn't need otherwise except for odor control. So they'll have things built into the permit that we can check. And, you know, if there's getting a lot of odor complaints, are your scrubbers working? Is the bleach in it? Is there water flowing to it? So those are the things that in the permit where they set the playbook up, we can go out and hold them to it.
One thing I'd also like to mention is that with MSD, you know, they do have a agreed board order with the Air Pollution Control Board to evaluate odors from Morris Foreman and the collection system west of 9th to the Ohio River. They've completed their first phase. That's the report. The reality, and some of that goes to their flaring, is that they also have, as part of their odor control system, a variety of different methods to control odors. And for example, the Fells Lane pump station, which is right there as you get off the expressway. They have an operation where solid material that won't go through their treatment plant is actually offloaded into a roll-on, roll-off dumpster. That building is under negative air. So when the door is closed, the air is pulled out from around that roll-on, roll-off dumpster, and it goes through scrubbers, carbon scrubbers, or some other type of scrubbing media. At the plant itself, part of what MSD has used since they discontinued their ZimPro process, and I was not here in Louisville when they did the ZimPro process, but I've heard about it, and it needed to have some improvements. They've moved from that other process to manage their solids into a system to develop the Louisville Green biofertilizer. They had 4 large dryers to dry their solids into this product. Over time, that process, the equipment began to age out, and I think, 2 years ago, they had a catastrophic failure of their dryer system. And so they had an emergency replacement of their dryer system, which helped to control many of those odors. That work should be completed. They also have another project that they will complete by 2026 that will better utilize some of that gas to run that dryer operation. So there are changes on the way for MSD at Morris Foreman. But again, that is taking some time. But that agreed board order with MSD is another example of ways that an existing facility can be compelled to further reduce odors.
So in section 2.7, it talks about an owner or operator incinerating or processing gases, vapors, or gas in transit effluent pursuant to this regulation shall provide properly installed and maintain a good working order and an operation devices as approved by the district for indicating temperatures, et cetera. Is this also something that's related to the flaring device case?
It may be. There are conditions that will apply to MSD and flaring. There are a lot.
So do you all determine, because this still keeps taking me back to those gaseous odors that were not just in one neighborhood, because I was doing a tour for some students, and across all the neighborhoods was gas. And I hadn't seen MSD flaring on a regular basis, but on that day I did. And so how do you determine whether or not, I want to know what happened on that day. I called and somebody was like, yeah, and they tried to explain to me what flaring was, but that really wasn't my question. My question was the flare, was that device, that whole system to incinerate or whatever it does, was that sufficient? So I just want somebody to know that I would love for that to be investigated. I have the date.
Okay.
I want to know why they were flaring, what were they trying to burn off, and whether or not what they were trying to burn off has the gaseous odor that I smelled throughout several neighborhoods.
Okay.
So I don't know specifically, but we'll get that date from you. They try to burn that gas in areas they need to produce heat. So that has a BTU value, that off-gassing from a sewer operation. So a lot of times it's being burnt in their dryers and not in the flare. When they don't need it for things that can be usefully used, they then flare. You can't just bottle that up. And my guess is they didn't have a specific need at that time. That doesn't mean they were doing it properly or that it was too much gas for that flare to handle, but they should have. It's designed to be able to handle that, and it should, you know, be hot enough to control that. On flares, and especially thermal oxidizers, we will have, you know, presence of flame indicators or temperature gauges, things like that. I'm not totally speculating that, you know, some odor is coming from the property, but if it was all out in different neighborhoods, it's probably coming up out of the sewers themselves on the street, and that flare is not directly involved with that gas. So
what would trigger a notice of violation for MSD if that were the case? If they were unable to control that amount of odor, what would prompt that? Since this was on a Saturday, you guys were closed. They are over the hazmat stuff, but I don't know if this is considered hazmat, and it might even, to me, it's a conflict of interest, but that's a different issue. But what would prompt? So could you all do an investigation to see, you know, how much came out? What were they flaring for? How long did they flare? What percentage? I think there's some percentage involved in
So
the flare stuff.
You'll let us know that date and time.
Oh.
When this kind of comes full circle, not to put the burden on Matt here, but when we write that permit, in addition to having that requirement that there be a visible flame, there'll be a temperature requirement, especially for thermal oxidizers. There'll be a specific operating range. But then there'll be record-keeping, reporting, and monitoring requirements that a company is required to do. And so it's not just that we tell them, burn it at this temperature. There's also the requirement that they show us that they monitored it, that it's recorded, and that it's within those operating parameters. With respect to the collection system, there are widespread reports from this summer with respect to odors. And so we understand that this summer has been a specific issue with MSD. And so
I believe so.
Okay.
I think we had on Jack.
okay, if you'll let us know, we'll take a look at that and see. One thing that MSD is required to do, and perhaps, Ebony, you can help me better understand if this would be helpful for you, is that in Section 3, there's a requirement that companies report to APCD any accidental or infrequent event that would cause an odor. And so MSD regularly reports to us under that condition, for example, when they're going to take down one of their sedimentation basins, which means they decant the water and then scoop out the poop. Sorry, but that's essentially what they do. That we receive notice of that, but they're not required to notify the public in any way. And we've talked to MSD about providing notice to the public when they have to take those steps to notify us. Would that be helpful, in your view, to the community in better understanding what may be happening at MSD? And you don't.
I think that would be helpful. I like
Okay.
more information than not having information. Of course, then I would take it one step further and say, this process routinely causes odors. What can we do to reduce or eliminate those odors here?
Fair enough. So if, and I think it's a good suggestion, what do you think would be the best way for us to have MSD alert the public to that? Would a website notice be sufficient? Would it, a Gov delivery notice like we use? Media is always good, but sometimes getting the media's attention can be a challenge, depending on what else is in the news. So if you'd like to think about how we can ask MSD to provide that information and make it accessible to as many people as possible, I'd love to hear that.
I'm kind of confused, but, you have a question. With those events that are planned that Rachel's describing, be one of the events that's included on that dashboard we have now? Okay. Those events that are planned ahead of time, the reports that they give us, we put them on our access division event dashboard that we have. So that's a place, like, if maybe you could check that date and go look at it now and see that, yes, it was a planned event, perhaps, but that's a good word. Pointing out.
They do report those as excess emission events under Section 3 is linked to excess emission reporting under Reg 107. So when they have one of these events, either planned or unplanned, they will report to us under Reg 107. We put those excess emission reports on our website.
Yeah, I mean, the only thing that comes to mind is, I mean, that everybody would, most people, well, a lot of people would gain access through text messaging, but then again, if people don't know that you have a system where you can alert folks of what's going on, then almost as though it doesn't exist. So you have to do a campaign around educating folks on what tools you have.
Would Lens Alert work?
Um,
And no answer needed. We'd have to,
I mean, if people knew about it, yeah.
Okay.
And if
All right.
there's more than just a lens alert telling me that there's a thunderstorm when I can already see it, then it would be helpful too, because, yeah.
Okay. That's very helpful. Thank you.
I'll echo again for all our folks online, feel free to speak up, unmute yourself. If you're having trouble unmuting, you can hit the raise hand button, which should be right at the bottom of your screen.
And for
Or
those,
feel free to just observe.
for those of you
Acceptable too.
who are online, Michelle has included a link to the excess emission events report on our website in the chat.
And we've got, we're planning on being here till 7:30, but don't feel like you're obligated to stick around either. We know your time is valuable as well, so we're not going anywhere, but don't let us keep you.
And if you do want to make comments, that public comment period ends on February the 16th. There is an evening public hearing for you to come and speak to the district if you'd prefer to make comments that way on February the 9th at 6 p.m. It's both in person and virtual. And a continued public hearing at 10 a.m. on March 15th. We look forward to seeing folks there as well.
Okay. So the date of that, it actually wasn't winter, but it was before the whole summer sewer odor episode. It was April the 2nd, sometime maybe between 2 and 4:30.
Of this past year, right?
2022.
2022. have just a moment, I'm gonna grab some water.
Well, I was just thinking we might ask Byron to redo the first part of the presentation and then see if we can, swap that in, but otherwise I would say tomorrow, but, looking over at Matt.
If the recording is sent to me, I can get it up.
Yeah.
As long as you take YouTube, upload it, I'll tweet it.
Sorry about that. I thought about it before we got started and then forgot to think about it.
But you're right, if I did that part of the recording right now, I could snip it to the beginning. So there are ways that can happen.
Do I have to redo the first part of the presentation or just go through those buttons so that we have the ability?
Sure.
to,
And you
you know,
can do it
Yeah, you can do it.
whenever you
Okay.
want. Do your own personal session as well.
Yeah. Yeah, if you can magic that together.
I'm almost certain I can. See.
That really mentioned.
My son has developed a fondness for watching gamers on YouTube, and decided he wanted to give it a shot himself, so he got him a pair of headphones for Christmas so he could record. The editing process, like I tried just cutting the first part of his video off. The editing process made me feel very old to not be able to figure it out for him.
Editing your pollution control board meetings is a little easier, I can assure you. But, so I think you'd be up to the task. I don't know.
Was it the technology, or were they trying to keep people from being able to pretend they had a better game than they really did?
No, it was finding video editing software that was in any way accessible to somebody who wasn't a professional video editor for free in particular. I also use a Chromebook, so I don't have Windows. I have to find creative ways.
The tools in YouTube are pretty useful.
Are they? Oh, that's good to know.
Worth noting.
Okay. I didn't know they even had the ability to edit in YouTube.
When I got here, they were on English sharing. Yeah, this is where we edit videos. And I was like, you can just do that what you're doing in YouTube. What?
Well, I might get with you tomorrow and see how you do this so that I have some clue.
It must be new or that I have it.
Folks online, I'll just point out, if folks in the room, I also invite any comments just on the general public meeting process or materials. You can send those our way anytime. That we always want to hear ideas on that, ideas on additional communication strategies to get voter reporting information further into the community and encourage use of that. We're very, very interested in hearing those ideas.
Absolutely.
Crowdsourcing ideas.
I mean, I would tell anyone anywhere how to report an odor. If there's a Facebook group that you want, if there was a Facebook group, I could go post odor information every single week, I would do it. If you told me that we should post odor reporting information every single morning on our Twitter and Facebook, I'd do that. We'd do anything, so just whatever's recommended. It's an odor account, it's just odor information 5 times daily. If it will help the community know more about this,
you just send more emails in general, so on default, some proportions.
The ratio.
Same ratio, just sending more emails. Party.
Looks like a tech master over there, like camera, new laptop,
Command center.
Shell Command Center.
I feel like it's been invested in my two screens. Unfortunately, every time I open it, calendar item. Things that happen here.
Outlook, so you can click on Outlook and it'll run and it'll bring up, because you have opening, you click on that, doesn't matter which one I click on for the name of the I also have, I don't usually do it my monitor, so I usually leave one of them. I sometimes have trouble finding my mouse cursor just because I forget things all over around. Yeah. I'll note we've lost a couple folks online. We're down to just a couple folks left there and a couple folks in the room. We're glad to stick around as long as you guys want, but if you guys don't have anything else, we'll probably go ahead and call it so you guys can get home.
Thank you all for coming.
Thank you, everybody, for coming.
Really
Thank you for the,
excellent discussion.
yeah.
Thank you.
So
I
appreciate
learned
it.
a lot, very informational. I feel like we should skip Friday, don't you think?
Yeah, please.
Take the day off.
Tell my bosses that.
Oh, wait a minute.
Thank you, everybody online, for joining us. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you all.